Bella Venezia! The city's graceful gondolas sweep with elegance through the Grand Canal. The majestic architecture soars above the calm and gentle lagoon. But there's more to this fair city than meets the eye. Today we're going to be looking at Venice's connection with a notorious Fourth Crusade that ended up ravaging the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, in 1204. And we're going to be thinking about why this small Mediterranean outpost wanted, in the 12th and 13th centuries, to carve out its own mini-empire. Crusading was embedded in the culture of Europe by the end of the 12th century. The idea of a crusade was essentially an armed pilgrimage, a war of the cross that would see Christians go off to fight the enemies of the church in return for forgiveness of their sins. This idea took off in Europe in 1096, when huge numbers of knights, noblemen and peasants of all stripes set off from France and Germany. They marched for over 3,000 miles to eventually capture the city of Jerusalem from the Islamic world. On the way, this First Crusade massacred thousands of Jews and Muslims, and even Eastern Orthodox Christians, as its members entered a world that was foreign to and different from their own. This, the First Crusade, resulted in the formation of 4 Crusader states in the Middle East, and these increasingly came under attack as forces of the Islamic world responded in kind to the violence of the Crusaders. In 1187, however, a turning point came when the Muslim leader Salah ad-Din managed to unite a great deal of the Islamic world against the Crusaders. He won a battle at the Horns of Hattin in Syria and managed to recapture the city of Jerusalem in 1187, putting the Crusaders very much on the back foot. Within a few years, he'd reclaimed most of the territory lost to the Crusaders in the Crusader states, and as a result, the Crusaders were continuously putting out even more cries of help to their friends in the West. The surviving Crusaders had issued repeated calls to the Pope in the West, urging that more manpower was needed to save the remaining territory of the Crusaders from further losses to the forces of Islam. Another crusade, actually the third, had been launched in the 1190s to recapture Jerusalem. This one was led by 2 kings, Richard the Lionheart of England and King Philip of France. They each brought with them large armies and immense resources, but still they failed to recapture the holy city of Jerusalem that had been lost to Salah ad-Din a decade earlier. The expected glories of Christian knights, invincible under God's favour, did not materialise, and these crusaders trundled home to Europe. Christians who remained in the Middle East, who by this time were the 2nd or even 3rd generation who had been born there, continued to appeal to the Pope for help. But the failures of the Third Crusade had had their toll. For Europe's kings, crusading was expensive. It also meant a long and perhaps permanent absence abroad, putting your own kingdom at risk from any wily usurpers that might be seeking a bit of power for themselves. For the everyday man, crusading to the Middle East was also going out of fashion. More recent holy wars had begun to occur more locally, foregoing the lengthy and often dangerous travel overseas that would be required to travel to the Holy Land. Crusades in the Baltic reflected this, which had taken place between neighbouring people groups and echoed local tensions. As such, by the end of the 12th century, crusading was a part of the fabric of society in the West, but the Crusader states were needing help. The idea of crusading itself needed a bit of revival, and this is where a young, ambitious pope was to come in. Lothar of Signy was unusually young to become the leader of the Catholic Church. He had been elected by his cardinals at the age of only 37 following the sudden death of Pope Celestine III. By this age, however, he had already demonstrated a deep passion for his faith. His treatise De Miseria Humanae, on the misery of the human condition, discussed at length the issue of man's fall, the problem of sin, and the necessity of redemption through the sacraments of the Church. Upon coming to the papacy, his writings demonstrated this recognition of his office as that of the utmost spiritual power in the world. His actions soon reflected this. He excommunicated and condemned secular leaders in Europe for their incestuous marriages and other vices. In his view, the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was the consequence of the moral failings of the Western world. It was only proper, therefore, that Lothar begin to consider the grand ambition of a new crusade. This would restore the lands lost in 1187 to Christendom and demonstrate God's glory in a renewed Christian Europe led by the papacy. And in 1198, Lothar, as Pope Innocent III, formally made this call for a new crusade. A leading preacher was appointed, Fulk of Newley, who toured Europe, ensuring that people heard the message put out by the young ambitious Pope. The crusade met with a lukewarm reception on the ears of kings, many of whom were preoccupied with conflict over the European lands. However, on the ears of princes the news was greeted with enthusiasm. One nobleman in particular took up the call with great promise. Tybalt was the Count of Troyes and the younger brother of Henry of Champagne, the titular King of Jerusalem until 1197 and the nephew of King Philip Augustus of France. Tybalt too was an ambitious young knight. He planned for a grand expedition by sea that would, on the advice of the famed Richard the Lionheart, attack the armies of Islam in Egypt and then go on to effect a conquest of the Holy Land. For such an expedition, Tybalt would need to consult the leading maritime nation of the Mediterranean world, and this is what brings us here to Venice. At the turn of the 13th century, Venice was one of the great maritime cities of the Mediterranean. Along with its rivals, Genoa and Pisa, Venetian merchants left their home port to ports as far as Jaffa in the east and Tangier in the west. Venetians enjoyed certain liberties under their doge that made trade the centre of its activities. In 1201, the Venetian doge, an elderly man in his 80s, was approached by 6 knights from France to make arrangements for their planned crusade. It was agreed that almost 5,000 knights, 9,000 squires and 20,000 foot soldiers would seek transport across the sea on Venice's fine fleet of galleys. Such a fleet was to be a costly enterprise for the Crusaders, totalling almost 84,000 silver marks. In addition, the Doge threw in 50 war galleys at Venetian expense. Indeed, the Doge Enrico Dandolo appeared very interested in the outcome of any planned crusade to the east. He requested that the Crusaders give to him half of any land, any territories that were captured by the crusade in the future. The Venetians also appeared to be a prudent people. At the same time as they negotiated the deal with the Crusaders, their merchants in Egypt were negotiating a trade deal with Muslims in Cairo. By the summer of 1202, the time had come for the planned crusade to gather and depart from the Venetian coast. But there was a problem. Only a third of the expected number had arrived for the crusade as planned. It could have been that the fervour surrounding Innocent III's call to crusade had waned since it had fallen on the ears of those young and impetuous knights of France. Indeed, one of the Crusade's initial leaders, Tybalt of Champagne, had already died of illness. More likely, perhaps the intended target of the Crusade, Egypt, appeared lacklustre when compared to the glories of the First Crusade's triumphal march into Jerusalem. Whatever the reason, however, the diminished force that landed on these shores in 1202 in front of Venice was simply unable to pay the vast sums of money that had been pledged to the Venetian leadership in 1201. Ever the opportunist, the aged Doge suggested an alternative means for the Crusaders to give their pound of flesh owed to the Venetians. A Venetian trading colony at Zara on the Adriatic coast had recently fallen to the King of Hungary. The Doge wanted it back. Would the Crusaders help? After that, the Doge promised, the Venetians would safely convey the Crusaders on the way to their intended target of Egypt. The Crusaders, now led by another Frenchman, the Marquis Boniface of Montferrand, agreed. Such was the apparent camaraderie between the Crusaders and the Venetian Doge that the Doge himself now took the cross, making the vows before God necessary to become a Crusader himself. It is also worth mentioning here that these vows enabled the Doge to take almost direct control of the expedition. This man was pragmatic to the last. As the autumn winds blew, off the Crusaders sailed out of the Venetian lagoon behind me and into the Adriatic to go and sack the city of Zara. The problem was that the Hungarians were a Christian people, part of that same church that was headed by Pope Innocent III. Wasn't the crusade supposed to attack the world of Islam anyway and restore the former glories of the once proud Crusader states of the East? On hearing of the Crusaders' situation in Venice, Pope Innocent III was furious. He had forbidden the Crusaders from accepting their agreement with the Venetians, but the Crusaders had gone ahead anyway. With their enormous fleet of Venetian warships, the Christians landed just outside the walls of Zara. The city was duly sacked, and the proceeds were split between the Venetians and the Crusaders. For attacking a Christian city, Pope Innocent now excommunicated the entire crusade itself, effectively cutting it off from official access to the sacraments of the church. The crusade had already been diverted from its aims. It was about to be diverted further. During the siege of Zara, a young prince from the east had approached the crusading army. This prince was a man called Alexius. He was from the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire in modern-day Turkey. Alexius was not a happy prince, however, for he had been kicked out of office in a palace coup which had ousted his father from the emperorship. He had sought refuge in the court of Philip of Swabia, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor and a close friend of Boniface of Montferrat, one of the leaders of the Crusade. The offer that Alexius made to the Crusaders was one that they could not refuse. Would the Crusade help him to regain the throne in Constantinople for his father? It would only be a short diversion after all, as many previous crusades had indeed stopped off in the city as the last bastion of Christianity before they made their way further east into the Islamic world. In return, Alexius would finance the Crusaders' invasion of Egypt, as well as supply 10,000 knights of his own for the campaign. What's more, once he was in the palace at Constantinople, Alexius promised that he would have the Byzantine Church of the East submit to the authority of the papacy. For over a century, the two churches had been split over theological differences, and chiefly the nature of where spiritual authority lay. In the West, this authority resided with the Pope, who believed himself to be the true heir to the Roman Emperor. In the East, spiritual authority belonged with the Byzantine Emperor. For any Western Christian of the 12th century, to hear of the Byzantine Emperor submitting to the power of the Pope was a hugely significant coup. Boniface and the Venetian Doge accepted the offer of the Byzantine Prince Alexius. They both had their own reasons for doing so. For Boniface, the de facto leader of the Crusaders, Alexius's offer promised the fortunes needed to pay off the vast debt now owed to the Venetians. For the Doge, any gains made in Constantinople would continue to advance the trading interests of the Venetians over that of their competitors, the Genoese and the Pisans. More generally, the Byzantine Empire was unpopular with Western Christians. They were regarded as heretics by many who needed to recognise the true nature of their faith through submission to the papacy. The promise of booty was also unlikely to go amiss among the massed army of the Fourth Crusade. Off the crusade sailed to the ancient walls of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Ah, that's much better. I've got a nice Italian coffee now, and we're by the canal in Venice on a charming evening, which is great. So, let's talk about the sack of Constantinople once the Crusaders arrived at the city's walls in the 1200s. The Crusade arrived before the huge walls of Constantinople in the summer of 1203. On the way, the Crusade had already ransacked Byzantine towns and the local countryside in an effort to feed their large army. Constantinople was a metropolis unlike any other in the medieval world. It is estimated to have been home to almost 200,000 people. Compare that with London at this time, which had a population of around 30,000. Situated as the bridgehead between Europe and Asia, Constantinople was surrounded on three sides by water, making it an extremely difficult target for attack. On its land side, the city was fortified by three layers of walls, first built during the reigns of the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century AD and strengthened thereafter. For centuries, the city had been at the centre of a vast empire that stretched across the Middle East and into Asia. By the 1200s, however, this empire had crumbled due to the continued pressure of invasion and political infighting among the Byzantine elite. In 1203, Constantinople was not the mighty capital that it once was, but it still must have posed a highly impressive sight for the arriving Crusader army. Almost immediately, the Crusaders laid siege to and captured Galata Tower on the northern peninsula of the city. This allowed the Venetian galleys to sail into Constantinople's natural harbour, called the Golden Horn. The sitting emperor, confusingly another Alexius III, took some time to act. When he eventually did, a good few weeks after the Crusaders had arrived, he led his army out to the Crusaders before the walls of the city, only to promptly turn around and seek security back within the city's walls. Alexius III soon fled the city at night, abandoning his people and taking with him a significant quantity of the city's wealth. So, what happened next was that once the Crusaders arrived at the walls of Constantinople, they arranged a deal with those inside. And the deal was that the young Prince Alexius would take power. With the Emperor's flight, Prince Alexius now had his chance. He was crowned as co-emperor with his old and blind father Isaac on August 1st, 1203. Problems soon began for the newly styled Alexius IV, however. He now had to fulfill his ambitious promises to the Crusaders and found the Byzantine coffers wanting. To gather the required sum, he ordered for church gold and silver across the city to be melted down on the Crusaders' behalf. Needless to say, destroying holy artefacts for the sake of Catholic crusaders did not go down well among Constantinople's Orthodox population. Soon, though, Alexius was ousted himself in a coup enacted by a man called Mursiphilus, a politician/military leader in the city. Mursiphilus took charge, and within the city itself there was a huge amount of anti-Crusader sentiment. It was clear that the crusading army no longer had an ally inside of the city's walls. After some deliberation among the crusading clergy, it was decided that a decisive assault be mounted on Constantinople. Such an attack on a Christian city was to be justified by the Byzantine removal of Alexius IV from power, and the fact that, in the Crusaders' eyes, the Byzantines did not follow the true religion of the Catholic Church in the West. This was far from the position of the Pope, who forbade the attack at all costs. A letter from Pope Innocent III, that fiery spiritual leader who had demanded a crusade in the first place, went unheeded and was in fact suppressed by the Crusade's leadership at this time. In April 1204, fair winds facilitated a Venetian assault on the sea walls of Constantinople. The new Emperor Mursiphilus had led a courageous attack on the Crusader land army with his Anglo-Saxon protectors, the Varangian Guard. However, even he had now fled. The city, under assault, was now leaderless. Crusaders now broke through the defences in the northwest of the city, taking one of the imperial palaces and launching further sorties into the city itself. A last desperate act from the defenders resulted in a fire that burned throughout the city and caused even more chaos. By the 13th of April 1204, the Crusaders had captured Constantinople. Once the Crusaders had entered the walls of Constantinople, havoc ensued. Palaces were looted, homes were burned to the ground, women were raped, and to top matters off, writes Nicetas Choniates, a chronicler of this sack who was actually there at the time, when the Crusaders entered the church of Hagia Sophia, the temple of the Holy Wisdom. There they even brought their animals in with them, and a common harlot was enthroned in the Patriarch's chair. Pope Innocent III was furious upon hearing of the sack, but he could do little. The army that he had hoped would restore Christian glory to the Holy Land had instead rampaged through one of the greatest Christian cities in the known world. For the Venetians, the influential maritime empire that had urged the crusade on, the financial rewards from the sack of Constantinople were significant. From the sack itself, they received a third of all the booty which was to pay off the costs owed them by the Crusaders. They also now gained complete dominance of trading rights in the city, something which had been denied them by previous emperors sat in Constantinople. Indeed, the city was now to be ruled by a Latin emperor who was, more or less in 1204, hand-picked by the Venetian Doge. That Doge, Enrico Dandolo, when he died in 1205, was in fact laid to rest in the Byzantine church of Hagia Sophia. The kingdom of Thessalonica was also to be Venetian, providing the maritime power of Venice with a vast swathe of the Greek coast and access to the goods and riches therein. As the flag of the Venetians ascended, that of the Byzantines was in the decline. Small enclaves of Byzantine aristocrats survived to carve out their own ministries in Trebizond and Nicaea. Constantinople itself was to be reclaimed by another Byzantine dynasty in 1261, remaining in Byzantine hands until its capture by the Turks in 1453. However, the city was never able to recover the grandeur of its position before the devastating assault of the Fourth Crusade. That holy enterprise, launched by a pope but derailed by its own financial demands, was to cast a long and gloomy shadow over Byzantium, the city of Constantinople, ever since that fateful year of 1204. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the History Chronicles. Please do post your comments below, like and subscribe, put on the notifications button, and also check out our Patreon page below. I'll see you next time back in merry old England for another episode of the History Chronicles.